One company just pumped enough groundwater in a single year to supply over 90,000 homes out of one of the driest counties in Arizona. That's legal. The company is Saudi-owned, growing alfalfa to ship overseas and feed cattle in a country where this exact crop is restricted at home. They don't pay a cent for the water itself. Meanwhile, land near their fields is cracking and sinking. The state sued them, and more than a year later, the state still can't make them stop. I want to tell you why, and it's not the reason you think it is. I work in water resources. I've spent years looking at basins like this one, and I want to be precise, because the chemistry and the hydrology matter more than the headlines do. So let's get the easy part out of the way first. This is not a story about a scary foreign company sneaking into the desert and stealing water in the middle of the night. I wish it were that simple, honestly, because that would be easy to fix. What actually happened is worse, because it means the door was propped open the entire time by people whose job was to notice the door. The company is Fondomonte Arizona. It's a subsidiary of Almarai, a major Saudi dairy producer. Since 2014, Fondomonte has been growing alfalfa on thousands of acres in La Paz County in western Arizona and shipping that alfalfa across the ocean to feed dairy cattle in Saudi Arabia. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Saudi Arabia restricts this exact kind of water-hungry farming inside its own borders because their aquifers already collapsed once from exactly this kind of pumping. So the operation didn't disappear when that happened. It relocated to a place with weaker rules and kept doing the same thing to a different aquifer. That's not an accusation. That's just where the water math pointed, and water math doesn't care which flag is on the equipment. And that history isn't a throwaway line. Saudi Arabia ran its own version of this exact experiment decades ago, growing wheat and alfalfa at massive scale on ancient, non-renewable groundwater. It worked, the way overdrawing any account works, until the aquifer dropped so fast the government had to phase the program down to keep from draining it past the point of no return. So when the same crop, the same water per acre problem moved into a different desert basin on a different continent, that's not a coincidence I'm reading into. That's an operation that already watched this exact ending happen once, choosing a jurisdiction where the ending hadn't been written into law yet. In 2023 alone, according to a hydrology report commissioned by the Arizona Attorney General's office, Fondomonte pumped roughly 31,196 acre-feet of groundwater. I know that number means nothing on its own, so let me put it in a shape you can actually feel. 1 acre-foot is enough water to supply about 3 single-family homes for a year. Do that math, and you get a company operating in a rural desert basin using enough water in 12 months to serve tens of thousands of households that don't exist there. And here's the part that should bother you professionally, not just emotionally. That number wasn't just big in isolation. It was over 81% of all the groundwater pulled from that entire basin that year. One operation, 81%, in a basin that other farms, other ranchers, and other towns also depend on to keep their taps running. Okay, so how does one company outconsume basically everyone else combined in an entire groundwater basin? This is the part where I have to correct the story people want to tell, because the real answer is more uncomfortable than a bad company came to town. The basin Fondomonte operates in is called the Ranagres Plain Basin. Until very recently, it sat outside what Arizona calls an active management area, which is the state's designation for basins with real enforced pumping limits. Outside those zones, in most of rural Arizona, groundwater law is close to a free-for-all. If you own or lease the land, and you can drill deep enough, you can pump. There is historically no volumetric cap on total withdrawal out there. Fondomonte didn't hack a system. It used the system exactly as it was engineered to be used, and that is a completely different and honestly scarier story than a company breaking rules. Now let's talk about what's actually happening underground, because this is not a side detail. This is the whole case wearing a smaller hat. Alfalfa is one of the most water-intensive crops you can grow anywhere on the planet, and this is happening in a desert alluvial basin with low natural recharge. That means the aquifer underneath does not refill fast. Picture it like a sponge holding up the floor of a house. When you squeeze water out of that sponge faster than rain and runoff can ever put it back. The sponge doesn't just sit there empty and wait patiently. It compacts. The layers of sediment that used to be held apart by water pressure collapse in on each other permanently. That's called subsidence, and it is not reversible on any timeline that matters to a person alive right now. You cannot reinflate a collapsed aquifer the way you reinflate a tire. Reports out of the area, including around Vicksburg in La Paz County, describe exactly that. Land cracking and sinking, along with nearby wells running dry. And this isn't just a vague impression from people driving by. State filings put an actual number on it. More than 40 centimeters of land subsidence measured across this basin over the last 15 years. That is not weather. That is not bad luck. That is not vandalism, and nobody's even trying to claim it is, which I actually respect, because at least nobody is insulting our intelligence on that specific point. What it is an aquifer physically losing its structural skeleton. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. Subsidence like that is usually a lagging indicator. By the time you can see cracked ground and hear about dry wells, the compaction underneath has typically been happening for a while already, quietly, below anyone's sightline, with no sensor network required by law to catch it earlier. And here's the monitoring gap that actually bothers me the most in this entire case, more than any single number. Outside an active management area, Arizona has historically not required real-time metering or public reporting of exactly how much water a large agricultural operation is pumping, well by well, month by month. The 31,196 acre-foot figure everyone is quoting, including me a minute ago, came from a hydrology report commissioned by the Attorney General's office after the fact, specifically because the state needed a number for litigation. That is not a routine public monitoring record sitting in a database somewhere that anyone could have checked in real time. That's a number that had to be reconstructed for a lawsuit. If the state needs to commission a special report just to find out how much water was pumped last year, that's not a minor paperwork gap. That's the entire management system telling on itself. Here's where the timeline gets genuinely interesting, because this did not sneak up on anyone. Fondomonte has been operating since 2014. That's a full decade before the Attorney General ever filed suit. In April of 2023, Arizona actually rescinded 2 well drilling permits for the company after officials said they'd found inconsistencies in the well applications. I want to be fair here. I don't have the granular detail on exactly what those inconsistencies were, and I'm not going to invent specifics I can't verify, because guessing at that would be exactly the kind of thing I'm criticizing everyone else for doing. But think about what that moment actually tells us on its own. Regulators were already close enough to this operation and concerned enough to pull back drilling permits nearly 2 years before any lawsuit existed. That's not a system that got blindsided in 2024. That's a system that had already noticed something in 2023 and chose to manage it quietly around the edges instead of confronting it directly and publicly. I want to flag something about that phrase, inconsistencies in the well applications, because that's a very diplomatic way to describe whatever actually happened on those forms. Diplomatic language in a regulatory document is usually doing a lot of quiet work. It's the kind of phrase that lets both sides move on without anyone having to say the word wrong out loud. I'm not going to pretend I know what those inconsistencies were beyond what's been publicly reported, because I don't. And inventing that detail would make me exactly the kind of source I'm telling you to be skeptical of. But permits don't usually get rescinded over a spelling error. Something in that paperwork was significant enough that the state chose to undo an already approved decision rather than let it stand. Then, in March of 2024, Governor Katie Hobbs let 4 of Fondomonte's state land leases in Butler Valley expire. On camera, that looks decisive. It looks like the state finally acted, finally drew a line. Here's the reversal, and it's an important one professionally. Butler Valley is a separate groundwater basin from the one actually driving this entire controversy. The real fight, the one with the cracking ground and the dry wells, is over the Ranagras Plain Basin, where Fondomonte kept operating on other leased and private land the entire time, completely unaffected by the Butler Valley decision. So the headline event, the one that got the press conference and the news cycle, didn't touch the water source that residents were actually losing sleep over. That's the kind of detail that sounds like a technicality. It is not. It's the entire accountability gap in the story, in miniature, wearing a nicer suit. By December of 2024, Attorney General Chris Mays filed an actual lawsuit, and I want you to pay attention to the legal shape of it, because it tells you something the hydrology alone can't. She didn't sue under water law. She sued under Arizona's Public Nuisance Statute, ARS Section 132917, an old legal doctrine usually reserved for things like a factory dumping smoke on a neighborhood. Why does that matter here? Because there was no water statute available that made this pumping illegal. None. So the state's own top legal office had to reach for a doctrine that has essentially never been tested this way in Arizona before, arguing that the pumping itself, legal as it technically is, was creating a nuisance for the people living around it. I want to say this plainly, because it's the kind of sentence that sounds harmless until you realize it's basically the entire case. That lawsuit is not proof the company did something illegal. It is proof that there was no law written to stop it in the first place, and everyone involved knew it, including the person filing the case. Now here's a twist that actually made me angry when I read it, and I don't get angry easily about paperwork. Even after all of this scrutiny, after permits had already been pulled once for inconsistencies, after the public nuisance lawsuit was already filed and making national headlines, Fondomonte received approval for a brand new well. This one permitted to a depth of 1,000 to 1,500 feet, capable of pumping around 3,000 gallons per minute. A local county official has said the company's existing wells combined can already pull as much as 64,000 gallons a minute out of that basin. Sit with that number for a second, because it's not a rounding error. The state is in active litigation, arguing in court that this company's pumping constitutes a public nuisance, while a different arm of that exact same state approved deeper drilling capacity in the same basin during the same window of time. I'm not saying that proves bad faith on anyone's part. I am saying it proves the left hand and the right hand were not reading from the same document. And in water management, that gap is where the real damage always happens. This is where I'd normally expect the story to settle into one villain and one hero, and it just doesn't hold that shape, which is honestly more useful to understand than a clean narrative would be. In August of 2025, a coalition of ranchers, farmers, and municipalities tried to intervene in the lawsuit. Their argument was straightforward, and I think it's a fair one. If a court rules that Fondomonte's legal pumping still counts as a public nuisance, that same legal logic could eventually apply to every other agricultural operation and every city pumping groundwater in unregulated rural Arizona. Judge John Blanchard denied them a seat at the table, calling their concern too generalized to justify letting them join the case. He even acknowledged in his own written ruling that this case is widely seen as a test case for groundwater regulation across the entire state. So think about that for a second. The people whose water rights this ruling will eventually help shape were told, officially, on the record, that this case isn't about them yet. There's another move in this case that deserves its own moment, because it tells you how the company itself is actually playing this. In its formal response to the lawsuit, Fondomonte argued the state shouldn't even be allowed to bring the case, leaning on a doctrine that says a party can't ask a court for help if it behaved unethically in connection with that same lawsuit. Here's the detail that made me raise an eyebrow. The company's own attorneys didn't offer specific examples to back that claim up. Not one. That's not a rebuttal. That's an accusation with the evidence field left blank. And around the same time, Fondomonte also asked the court to pause discovery, the part of the process where both sides have to actually hand over evidence, arguing it shouldn't have to produce anything expensive and disruptive while a motion to throw out the case was still pending. Read plainly, that's a company asking to be excused from proving its unproven claim about the state's conduct, while also asking to be excused from handing over its own records. That's not a smoking gun, but it is a pattern, and the pattern is resist producing data at almost every turn in a case that is fundamentally about whether enough data existed in the first place. I understand the legal logic behind that denial. Courts generally don't want a lawsuit to balloon into every stakeholder with a theoretical future interest. That's a reasonable, boring, procedurally correct instinct most of the time. But it creates a strange dynamic here, because everyone in the room, including the judge, agrees this is a test case. A test case, by definition, is not really about the two named parties. It's about the precedent that gets set for everyone standing outside the courtroom door, telling those people they don't have standing to participate, while simultaneously admitting the outcome will shape their future, is one of those sentences that sounds procedurally tidy and substantively uncomfortable at the exact same time. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because right as this case was heating up, the actual regulatory fix that everyone claims to have wanted for years finally showed up. On January 9th, 2026, the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources signed a formal order designating the Ronagras Plain Groundwater Basin as a new active management area, the exact regulatory tool that had been missing this entire time. You'd think that would resolve things cleanly. It didn't. And here's the mechanism most coverage glossed over. Inside an active management area, the state hands out what are called grandfathered pumping rights, but only to whoever was legally using groundwater the moment the area was declared. Which means, if a court later finds that Fondomonte's pumping was, in fact, an unlawful public nuisance, the company could lose its grandfathered right to keep pumping at all, new regulation or not. So this lawsuit isn't a redundant sidetrack running next to the new rule. It's the thing that decides whether the new rule even protects this company going forward. Fondomonte, unsurprisingly, immediately asked the court to pause the entire lawsuit while that new administrative process ran its own multi-year hydrology study of the basin instead. In May of 2026, Judge Scott Minder ruled on that request, and his ruling is honestly the most revealing document in this entire case. He refused to fully pause the lawsuit, but he also ordered both sides to build a schedule that coordinates with the new active management area process going forward. And in that same order, he wrote something I think more people should be paying attention to. He questioned whether the ADWR's multi-year study would even be able to resolve who is responsible for the past overuse that has already happened, the cracked ground and dried wells that already exist right now. Read that again because it matters. The judge overseeing this case is on the record doubting that the new regulatory process can actually answer the exact question the lawsuit exists to answer. That is not a footnote. That is the entire uncertainty of this story, stated out loud by the one person in the room whose job is to be precise about it. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how genuinely contested this still is. After that ruling, Fondomonte's spokesperson called it a significant victory, saying the court understood the need to coordinate with the state's process. Attorney General Mays also called it a win, saying the ruling kept her lawsuit on track and moving forward. Both sides walked away from the exact same ruling, claiming they'd won. That does not happen when a case is actually settled, one way or the other. That happens when a case is still genuinely up for grabs, and everyone close to it knows it, and is managing the narrative accordingly. So let's talk about what this actually costs, because I don't want the human side of this to get buried under scheduling orders and legal procedure. Residents in La Paz County are living on private wells in a basin where more than 80% of the water is being pulled by a single operation. Land is cracking under their feet. Wells are drying up on properties that have nothing to do with alfalfa. Ranchers and municipalities across rural Arizona are watching this case closely, because the same unregulated pumping rules that allowed Fondomonte to operate here also govern their own water access somewhere else. And taxpayers are funding a landmark test case, one that could take years to resolve, built on a legal theory that has never been proven to work in this state before. With no guarantee, it survives an appeal even if it wins. This is not an abstract policy debate happening in a courtroom far away from anyone's life. It is people's actual water pressure, literally and financially, sitting on the outcome of an argument about whether legal pumping can still be called a nuisance. Picture the actual physical scene for a second, because I think the legal language flattens it out too much. Somewhere out past Vicksburg, there's a house with a well that used to reliably pull water, and now sputters or runs dry or pulls up water with more sediment in it than it used to because the water table underneath it dropped. That homeowner didn't do anything differently. They didn't change their habits or their pump or their pipes. The ground underneath the entire region moved instead. Meanwhile, a few miles away, center pivot irrigation lines are running full pressure over alfalfa that's headed for a port, and then a boat, and then a barn on the other side of the planet. Both of those things are true at the same time, in the same basin, under the same sky, and only one of them currently has a court case attached to it. The geography here does the story no favors if you're trying to make this feel abstract. La Paz County isn't some remote pocket nobody passes through. Interstate 10 runs right past a good chunk of this farmland, so if you've driven from California into Arizona in the last decade, you've likely seen these exact green alfalfa fields sitting in the middle of visibly dry, brown desert. That color contrast should have been a public question years before it became a lawsuit. Green doesn't happen by accident in that landscape. It means water is being moved from somewhere it's scarce to somewhere it's grown into a commodity and shipped away. Here's the standard of care question I keep coming back to, because it's the one that actually matters if you manage water systems for a living instead of just watching them from the outside. A basin like this should never have needed a lawsuit to discover it had no ceiling on total withdrawal. Active management areas exist precisely because someone, decades ago, already understood that unmetered pumping in a low recharge desert basin was a mathematical certainty of failure, not a maybe. The state had that tool sitting on a shelf. It just didn't apply it here until the wells were already drying up and the ground was already sinking. That is not a foreign company outsmarting American regulators with some clever trick. That is a regulatory system that waited for visible damage to justify using a fix it already owned, a pattern I've seen in water management long before this case existed. The tool almost always exists before anyone reaches for it. What's missing is the will to use it before the damage forces the issue, which is exactly backwards from competent resource management. You monitor first, you act on the data, you don't wait for the ground to crack before deciding the data was worth collecting. So here's my actual thesis, and I want to say it clearly instead of dancing around it for another 10 minutes. This was never really a story about one uniquely villainous foreign company. Other operations, including plenty of domestic ones, pump enormous amounts of water in other unregulated Arizona basins too, right now, with far less attention. What makes this particular case different is scale and visibility, not necessarily uniqueness. This is a story about a state that wrote its rural groundwater law with no ceiling built into it at all. Discovered the ceiling was necessary only after wells went dry and land started sinking, and is now trying to regulate an aquifer and litigate its own past failure to regulate that same aquifer in two separate rooms, on two separate timelines, using two separate agencies at the same time. And that basin is still there, right now, as of this recording, mostly uncapped in practice, while the lawsuit grinds through scheduling orders and a multi-year hydrology study that even the judge isn't sure will answer the question everyone actually wants answered. The alfalfa is still growing out there under center pivot sprinklers in triple-digit heat. It's still getting cut, baled, and shipped across an ocean to cattle that will never taste a single drop of Arizona water themselves. The land in Vicksburg is still settling into the space the water used to fill, quietly, a little more every season, and somewhere under a basin that nobody was required to meter until it was already too late, the ground is still, deciding, right now, how much more of itself it's willing to give up before anyone with the authority to stop it actually does.